Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming in on this rainy April morning to hear more about cardiac function, and today in particular about cardiac integrated function, sort of where we go from more macro levels, from the micro levels that we've been looking at, cellular and such, a little bit more in terms of theoretical measurements or bases of arrhythmias and such. And we'll look at today more integrated function, how this whole system is controlled in order to change performance in response to neural inputs, and also how a little bit more about how disorganized activity during arrhythmias occurs, and how early warnings of this, or in fact late warnings of this, manifest themselves in the EKG. So, starting back where we left off, we're talking about the EKG, and we've made much to do about refractoriness, and that absolute refractory period and relative refractory period, and also the various phases of the EKG as it relates to the action potential. We have the P wave here from an EKG, and then we have the transmembrane action potential for some region of the ventricle, in which we have our phase 0 upstroke, our phase 1 rapid repolarization, phase 2 plateau, phase 3 final repolarization, and phase 4 rest. And we see sort of how this maps on. The P wave, of course, is absent from any of the electrical activity here because that represents excitation of the atrium. There's a delay between the P and the QRS complex as things progress through the specialized conduction system with a delay, so the onset of contraction of the ventricle is delayed. And then we have our QRS complex, a complicated indicator of where the rapid depolarization is, and then the T wave, which reflects both the time and spatial distribution of the repolarization phase. And we've talked a bit about repolarization, what happens when you get an ectopic stimuli in a single cell here, and you move from that one type of action potential, that fast upstroke action potential, to a slow action potential mediated by calcium, and how there is an absolute and a relative refractory period. Now, the absolute and relative refractory period, of course, we related to where you were in repolarization, where the calcium channel is reactivating, where the sodium channel reactivates. On the QRS complex, we have a rough map of it. We have our absolute refractory period, absolute because you're already firing an action potential there. Nothing is set up to cause regenerative type behavior. Relative is that region where we transition from a very weak calcium-mediated action potential to a sodium-mediated action potential. And I say approximate here because it's sort of a fuzzy concept. The closer you are to the absolute refractory period, the bigger stimulus you need. And then also, remember that the QRS complex and the T wave aren't just time phenomena of a single membrane action potential. They are, in fact, the sum of a lot of cells that are spatially distributed. So it's a spatial and temporal thing. And that's part of the reason that a premature beat during the T wave can result in ventricular fibrillation. Because spatially, you have heterogeneity here. Some of your cells are going to be in the absolute refractory period, some of them are going to be in the relative refractory period. If an ectopic focus, such as an early after depolarization occurs here, what's going to happen? Well, those that are in the absolute refractory phase are not going to fire, and those that are in the relative ones are going to fire a very slowly propagating action potential in the opposite direction from which the normal repolarization is occurring. And if things are slow enough, this can set up the conditions for a spiral wave or for re-entry around a form of block. And that's why a premature beat during the T wave is particularly bad because of its ability to result in atrial and ventricular fibrillation. So refractoriness has a spatial component as well as a temporal component, because the action potential, as it propagates through tissue, has a time and space component to it. So one of the things we need to know are terms. And automaticity. Automaticity is basically pacemaker activity. It's the ability of tissue to beat on its own. Automaticity in the sinoatrial node is a good thing. That's what gives you your normal control of rate and rhythm. Automaticity can also occur because of damage to tissue, causing a big leak that overcomes that IK1, that inward rectifier. And automaticity in working myocardium is in general thought to be an ectopic focus or a bad thing, because it can occur at critical times during those T waves and initiate reentrant type of arrhythmias. Rhythmicity just means regularity of rhythm. It's a term you'll run into and need to know. So you have a pacemaker hierarchy. Normally, it's the SA node. That's what drives everything. That's the fastest. Sometimes you have ectopic atrial sites, and then the AV node and the His-Purkinje system can, in fact, also act as pacemakers, particularly the AV node. So an ectopic pacemaker is just anything associated with the word ectopic, means it's outside of the normal range. So any ectopic pacemaker is outside the SA node. Any ectopic pacemaker is likely to be proarrhythmic in the face of normal SA node activity. So these are also not, in general, subject to normal regulation of your heartbeat to influence your input and output of blood from the heart and maintaining your blood pressure. Modulation of pacemaker activity rate is very, very important in regulating cardiac outflow, and it's influenced by a number of factors. The most important pair of factors we're going to talk about are the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, which, as you might guess from the words, sympathetic acts in one direction, parasympathetic in general sort of operates in the opposite direction. So we have two things that are working on it. And how do they change the rate of firing of the SA node? Well, there were in general a bunch of ways that could be manipulated to do this in terms of regulating how low what the rate of diastolic depolarization was. Well, you could also change the threshold for it, and you could also change the maximum diastolic depolarization and change the length of the interval between action potentials from your pacemaker. So to do that, how do we do that? Well, you have to inject currents in there. So we have additional currents that are strongly regulated by the parasympathetic and sympathetic activation. And the main way that it does it is changes that slope of phase 4 depolarization. So there are a lot of mechanisms that can do this in disease or in response to drugs, but in general, we're going from A to B here in terms of changing the rate of diastolic depolarization with sympathetic or parasympathetic tone. We change that rate, we change the rate at which the heart beats and which things polarize through. And how does that do it? It works through ionic currents. So it has to modulate the ionic currents that are there or stimulate different ones. So we have our nodes. They do different things in order to make the heart work in a very synchronized fashion. And you'll look at here, we have sort of vagal activity or sympathetic activity. And vagal activity tends to depress sinus node rate. And it also, the sympathetic activity, an increase in that, will tend to push it up. Like so, sort of oppositely directed. We have two reciprocal regulators working on this system. Very typical of physiologic systems, and that you have at normal rest, you have a balance of two systems, and that you have redundancy in the ability of the tissue to respond to changes in demand. So we have more than one regulatory system, two of them operating normally in balance. One depresses, the other accelerates. Same thing for the AV node. The AV node, we haven't talked much about its pacemaker mechanisms. Very similar to those of the SA node, but much slower, so that you don't really use that unless you have problems with your sinus rhythm. Same thing. You have an increase in vagal activity, and then in the AV node, you would have a change in rate. But since rate isn't really what's important in the AV node, what is important is the delay. How quickly can an action potential go through there, so that what's the delay between the atrium squeezing and the ventricle squeezing? And so you can think about that. If you want to beat your heart quickly, you need all parts of it to be working quicker. If you want to rest and go slow, you can have a bigger delay. You know, a lot of time to push that extra blood into the ventricle and fill, a lot of time to contract and go out. But if you're getting ready to run away from a lion or something like that, you would want your AV nodal time to decrease. You would want that conduction, that speed of conduction, to increase. And so that has to be done through either being able to bring it up to threshold more quickly, which is what that increase in intrinsic pacemaker rate does, and then also to generate a larger current to fire the adjacent cells more quickly. So with sympathetic activity, you increase nodal conduction or decrease nodal delay. Vagal activity, oppositely directed. If you have high vagal activity, you will decrease nodal conduction and slow things down. Same thing for refractoriness. So the AV node acts kind of as a filter. It has with it a very simple sort of refractoriness, because it's not a very fast action potential like the working myocardium. And so it has to have its refractoriness shortened if you're going to beat quickly. So when it gets that simple sympathetic nervous system signal saying, oh, I see a threat, and your heart starts to beat faster, it can pass things more quickly because that refractoriness will decrease. So that action potential will shorten, and those currents will start recovering quicker, and you will get an ability to pass a more rapid train of pulses through the AV node, both through an increase in conduction and a decrease in sympathetic activity, or a decrease in refractoriness. Vagal stimulation, essentially oppositely directed. So remember, we have that timing then, and all these things are under neurohormonal control, although to differing degrees. You have your sinoatrial node, which excites the right atrium and left atrium fairly quickly, a large delay due to the AV node, and then the His-Purkinje system, which propagates electrical activity very rapidly through to the ventricle, causing that QRS complex and contraction, and then we have relaxation following. So again, when I show you a figure this often, the terms in this figure and the order and what they mean are likely to be very important for the exam. So we have that again here in terms of the EKG. We know sort of what's going on between here and here, because we have our atrium firing, and then we have a delay until this QRS fires. The QRS, because of its shape and orientation, tells us really how synchronized the firing of the ventricles are, and the T wave similarly tells us how long it's taking for repolarization to occur, and how stable that is, and certain other information. Now, that's because it is a little bit difficult to completely interpret, because you have tissues that look very different in their electrical configuration. As you go here in the SA node, you have that classic pacemaker activity. Within this figure from Netter's illustrations. So the SA node, a little bit of tissue up here, probably even smaller than that. So you have this classic slow action potential, the very fastest diastolic depolarization. No stable resting membrane potential. It has an unstable resting membrane potential. That's why it functions as an oscillator. Then you have your atrium, and there are some fibers in here that may be conducting things a little bit more quickly to get down to the AV node. But you see that has the classic working myocardium architecture. Rapid upstroke, phase 1 rapid repolarization, a plateau with a distinct shape, repolarization, and a flat, stable resting membrane potential. So you propagate through there. Then you have your AV node, the thing that connects you through this fibrous resistive disc of tissue here. And it's a pacemaker as well, because it doesn't have a stable resting membrane potential. You see this DVDT here, much, much slower than the SA node. The DVDT is actually a bit faster because it has more channels there, and it also has a component of T current in general that goes with it. So more than one type of calcium channel fires action potentials at a little lower threshold. But generally gives you a nice slow propagation through here. Can act as a pacemaker should something happen up here. Also acts as a filter. If you get atrial fibrillation, where you're rapidly providing impulses here, that refractory period of the AV node will sort of filter these out so that you only get action potentials as fast as the AV node will allow them through. Again, sort of redundancy and safety factors built into your cardiac system. His and Purkinje system. Here, spreading excitation very, very rapidly. Only weakly contractile type behavior, but has, again, the classic fast action potential from your textbook with the repolarization. And then repolarization actually of the tissue itself has a spatial distribution and a different shape in the ventricle, so that you get sort of a merging of things here. This QRS complex represents a spatial average of what's going on during this time. So that if your spatial distribution is not uniform, you will get what's known as fragmentation or fractionation of the QRS complex, and that will indicate that you have a block somewhere in the specialized conduction system, one of the classic things being right bundle branch block after an infarction of some sort, where that propagation actually has to occur through the tissue, so the ventricle goes much later if you have an infarct, say, blocking here. So, viewed spatially then for the electrical behavior going through, you have your SA node, and it propagates around and through the atrium. It's really not showing you the atrial distribution for this, but it is showing then some of the more important things. As you get into that, go through the AV node, you have that delay, then you start to depolarize that septum. So you start pulling the heart up from the middle first. It's excited and starts contracting, and then that contraction spreads to the endocardium from the apex to the base. Always kind of funny. This is the base of the heart, and this is the apex, and that always confuses people because the apex points down, but the apex is sort of the point of it. The base is where that fibrous base is that separates it from the other tissue, until you finally get uniform excitation. And then you have repolarization occurring as it goes, you have depolarization occurring from the endocardium out and up through the epicardium until you get uniformly repolarized, and then you start to depolarize, and then you start to repolarize. So you have this spatial basis going on here. You have this is the first portion occurring, also where the first portion of contraction will occur. Then you have a spread from the endocardium to the epicardium, and from apex up to the base. And that gives you, of course, at a distance, this complex QRS type of behavior. Now, I said the QRS complex and the fact that you can't observe events like the His bundle firing from the surface EKG is because the source is not large enough. Well, in your book, they have what's known as actually a His bundle electrocardiogram or an intracardiac electrocardiogram. So if you want to be invasive of a patient, you can actually start to measure some of these other things. And you place an electrode on a catheter or snake it up the leg and into the atrium and then finally into the ventricle from the venous return, and you position it correctly, you can record that firing of that very small His bundle system. And you start to see a lot more complex behavior as the spatial distribution becomes less merged by the distance or filtering of it. And so you can see you have your atrium firing, you can see much more complex behavior. You have two chambers firing, one really first and the other second. And so you have this sort of merged behavior here. You have your His-Purkinje system firing, so you have what would be your AV nodal delay, things spreading to the ventricle. You have the different regions of the ventricle firing. And again, the spatial distribution is now measuring something from the net current from the inside, so you get much larger currents for certain spatial distributions, but not others. And then, of course, you repeat the cycle. So this His-Purkinje system is there as part of that delay between the P wave, which corresponds to the atrial depolarization, and the QRS complex, which is a very complicated sum of the different chambers. And you see the conventional electrocardiogram for this filtered up above. And so you see the QRS complex has quite a bit of complexity in it. You can see that fast notch of repolarization or that J wave type of behavior a little more clearly here. And provides a detailed thing about what's going on. And you can actually see some of the different chambers. There are ways of spreading those out by positioning the electrodes on the surface of this body to help you pick out, say, if a region of tissue has hypertrophied, in which case you're going to get a larger signal from electrodes close to the region that is hypertrophied. You will get smaller electrical signals from areas that are infarcted and no longer electrically active. And so you get a lot of things that go on. In the AV node, conduction is slow, and with an internal electrode you can measure this more precisely as that PR interval or on the surface, or the AH interval from the intracardiac electrogram. ACH, we know then, is going to slow that AV nodal conduction. You can actually watch that directly. What is acetylcholine? Acetylcholine is the primary transmitter of the parasympathetic nervous system. It acts to slow things down. So it is the parasympathetic nervous transmitter. So when I talk about the parasympathetic nervous system, I'm talking about acetylcholine. And so adrenergic antagonists, those will actually speed up AV nodal conduction. They'll decrease that PR or AH interval. Beta adrenergic system, or the adrenergic system, is the sympathetic nervous system. So we have the sympathetic and then parasympathetic nervous system. Acetylcholine is for parasympathetic. Adrenaline or adrenergic or epinephrine, norepinephrine are for the sympathetic system. So you have AV nodal conduction is sped up, or the delay is decreased by the sympathetic nervous system, and it decreased by the parasympathetic. And these are the endogenous neurotransmitters, adrenergics. Adrenaline, adrenergic neurotransmitters for the sympathetic system, and acetylcholine for the parasympathetic. And if we get a very long lengthening of that PR interval, what does that mean? Well, that means that we have either slowed the delay of propagation through there very far, or increased the refractoriness of that AV node a very long way, and we get what's known as first, second, or third degree AV block, those differing in their severity. First is just a major slowing, second is where you actually start to skip beats, and third is where you just don't see any propagation through the tissue. So you get differing degrees of block there. And so the effects of the autonomic nervous system on the SA node: parasympathetic tone, you increase parasympathetic tone, that is, you increase ACH, particularly through the vagus nerve, you will decrease SA nodal rate. Decrease that, the SA nodal rate will go down. Sympathetic tone, just the opposite. You increase it, you'll increase the SA nodal rate, you increase your heart rate. That's easy to remember when you remember that sympathetic is adrenergic. You get a burst of adrenaline, your heart rate goes up. It's the fight or flight type of reflex. Parasympathetic, ACH. Para, opposite, kind of like the orientations on those molecules you had to learn in organic chemistry. So parasympathetic slows it. Same thing then with the conduction. We're trying to hype up the system with sympathetic. We want conduction to speed up, and we want conduction to slow down if we're going to activate the parasympathetic system. So we would go from a faster medium to a slower. Two systems working simultaneously, balancing one another at rest. They're not always equal and opposite at under normal conditions, but they are, in fact, both active under normal conditions and play on-off against the other. And as we study this, we need to know that electrocardiography is an important tool. That ECG, going back to that ECG before, it provides information amplitude on the amplitude of the P wave, the QRS, the ST segment, the T wave, and the QT interval. It's a spatial as well as temporal system. So we can tell by placing many electrodes on the heart the anatomical orientation of the heart. Has it gotten squeezed as it does very regularly, say in pregnancy? The orientation of the heart will move as organs are shifted around in the body to make room for fetal growth. The relative size of the chambers. So when you have particular types of diseases, you will see hypertrophy of various chambers. With sustained atrial fibrillation, it's most often accompanied by hypertrophy of the atria. So you get very, very large atrium. So you get a large atrium, you get a large and very diffuse P wave. If you have hypertrophy, extensive hypertrophy of the ventricular wall, of course that's going to affect the size of that T wave repolarization as well as the QRS complex. If you have a disturbance in conduction, example for bundle branch block, you will see a fragmented QRS complex where the QRS complex fires in a way that's much wider and more jagged than you see in normal tissue. That's because the right ventricle is not working in conjunction with the left ventricle, for instance. And then disturbances in repolarization. If you start to have calcium loading and you get unstable behavior, kind of like those EADs that we saw before, but before they approach an EAD, you'll get what's known as alternans in those T waves. Those T wave alternans are an early signal, and in fact, what's commercially been very popular now is a measure called microvolt T wave alternans. And these are big predictors of your propensity to have an arrhythmia, and in fact, in terms of T wave alternans, where it goes in and out, is a strong indicator that you're going to have a sudden cardiac event, and very soon. So these disturbances in rhythm can be picked up with the EKG, as well as more mundane ones like, well, Is your heart just beating too slow? And do you need a pacemaker? Or is your heart beating out of synchrony? If the AV node is blocked, is it breathing out of synchrony? Is the atrium trying to contract asynchronously from the ventricle? And we'll get to some examples of some of these things a little bit later on. So it's a really important tool. And it's integrated. It's tells us a lot about the whole heart's effect. And and when I say it tells us changes about their excitable and excitable regions, it can give you a good example of the extent and location of ischemic damage. So when an EMT comes to a person's house and they think they might have had a heart attack, first thing they do is slap an EKG on them and record it for a few minutes, and it gets telemetered off to the hospital, and they can tell you, oh yeah, he's had a heart attack. It's a big one, it's a little one. And then there are other things that can cause heart problems and arrhythmias, with excessive dehydration or hypokalemia. You get altered electrolyte concentrations. And you've heard of these people who've been executed. For instance, would be an extreme one where they actually give a bolus of high potassium and send the heart into cardiac arrest as part of the lethal injection procedure. That's because the high K will affect your K currents. They will cause your membrane to depolarize. If it depolarizes too far, it will simply lose. Everything will go refractory. It will not recover, and you will have a heart attack and die. So these rhythm disorders can also be monitored if you're in a bad way with your kidneys or something. All these will affect it, and they go through the molecular mechanisms that we've been talking about, particularly high potassium here. So high potassium, just to bring you back now from up to an EKG from that basic sort of biophysics before, the Nernst equation. Here's another form of the Nernst equation. This one we have RT, which is the gas constant, temperature in degrees Kelvin, Z. Z is the valence of the particular ions, and F is the Faraday, because we need to convert from units of charge into units of moles to get chemical energy, and vice versa. So, and then we have the ratio of the outside to the inside potassium. And EK normally is around minus 97 millivolts for 4 millimolar outside intracellular, say, of 150. So right around minus 100. So maybe 10 millivolts more negative than the normal resting membrane potential for a cell. Because remember, the resting membrane potential is always more depolarized than EK because you have the presence of background leak currents. If you get a bolus of high K for some reason, either you've been given a lethal injection, or somebody screwed up at the hospital, or a small child got into their grandparents' salt shaker of KCl, which is sometimes used as a salt substitute for people who have high blood pressure, and swallowed a bunch of that, you can get a high bolus of K. Your cells will depolarize because EK is now at minus 67. You're still going to be several millivolts above that. You're going to be at minus 60 or so. Your sodium channels will have inactivated. You will no longer be firing appropriate action potentials. So that IK1 that's holding things down there near EK has moved very, very positive in terms of its reversal potential. And this also happens during ischemia. During ischemia, that sodium-potassium pump is no longer working effectively. ATP goes down, ATP-sensitive calcium channels open up, and there's a complicated system by which, in that first 15 minutes post-infarction, you lose a lot of potassium into your serum in the heart. And in fact, high potassium in the urine or in the blood is one way, or particularly in the blood, is one way of diagnosing whether or not you've had a myocardial ischemic episode. So you dump a lot of potassium. And so after aortic occlusion, here, in this example, you have a slow buildup of extracellular potassium from normal levels down around 4 or so and up. And your resting membrane potential, normally down here around -90, will start to go up. This goes up, jumps up pretty quickly, and it follows up, and it roughly mirrors the time course of that accumulation of potassium. And when you get up here, around -75 to -60, you're in big trouble. So within a few minutes there, you're starting to inactivate a lot of your sodium channels. Things are no longer going to conduct quickly. You're going to have a region, of course, if you've got an infarction there, that's non-conductive. You've set up all those conditions that we talked about: slow conduction, delay, changes in repolarization, and a tendency towards a calcium-mediated action potential, which would load the cells with calcium, tend to give you ectopic beats. You've set up all the conditions now to set up a reentrant arrhythmia or to go into fibrillation. So if you have transient ischemic episodes, K goes up. It's going to affect your heart very adversely. Even if you don't have an infarction, it can still be lethal because you are going to have arrhythmias associated with it. So if your blood gets occluded, say from plaque or something like that, it even can be transient, you're going to see a sudden, within a few minutes, change in the resting membrane potential. You're no longer going to be hyperpolarized. You're no longer going to be down there. Now that says resting potential. I apologize for that. That should say EK. Resting membrane potential will be somewhat more positive from that. So it would be going basically from -90 to -60. But the general principle is there. You're going to see a nearly 30 millivolt depolarization in your membrane potential. You're going to inactivate your sodium channels. You're going to reduce that inward current. The safety factor for propagation is going to be greatly decreased. You're not going to be able to propagate very well because you don't have that big current to serve as a sink for going through there. And that slows your conduction velocity, increases calcium loading, and because the regions oftentimes a coronary artery perfuses are fairly limited, you're having regional changes in conduction velocity. So you're setting up that system there where you can have a regional block that is transient. So you can have reentry through that reentry type of mechanism we were talking about before, where you have the tissue, it's got prolonged repolarization and slowed conduction. Impulse comes by through one path, is not able to pass, and then it can pass later on, and that sets up this system by which it leads to arrhythmias. So again, changes in this T wave and then the QRS complex will accompany ischemia. If the sodium currents are going way down, what's going to change? The QRS complex, particularly if it's in the ventricle, let's say. If you have transient ischemia in the ventricle, that QRS complex is going to be greatly decreased as this depolarization occurs. You will start to see changes in the T wave, particularly as things get calcium loaded and you have calcium-mediated action potentials. This is before you have an arrhythmia, but after you've had an event. In the atrium, same sort of thing can happen. You will see changes in the P wave if you're having a transient ischemic episode there. So immediately, if you have an infarction, depolarization of the occlusion of the artery, depolarization of the membrane, changes in the QRS complex accompany it immediately. They will be regional to, of course, the region in which the hypoxic or ischemic episode has occurred. So that's one of the ways you can use an EKG to pick up a problem. Perhaps the most simple one, an example from your book, is what happens if you have a sick sinus? How do you pick that up? Well, what do you have? you have, under normal rhythm, P wave, QRS complex, T wave, P wave, QRS complex, T wave, P wave, QRS complex, T wave. So if the heart starts beating quickly, what happens? Heart starts beating quickly from sinus tachycardia, that is, something's wrong with your sinus, or in fact, if nothing's wrong with your sinus, tachycardia simply means a very rapid heartbeat. Now, if you have, for instance, seen something really horrible in a horror movie, your heart starts beating fast, you will be in sinus tachycardia. And so you'll see a P wave, QRS complex, P wave, QRS complex, and these P waves will be occurring at regular intervals. They will always be well timed in front of the QRS complex. In this particular case, you can see that the delay is actually shortened somewhat between there and the QRS complex, particularly after the first beat. So you've got a shortened delay, everything indicating you've got a burst of adrenaline, you're going on. You have your normal T wave. It's difficult to see on this particular layout, but there is a T wave there. But the important thing is you're seeing a P wave, QRS all the time. Same thing here. You're in sinus bradycardia. You can still see a P wave. You have your QRS complex, and you have your T wave. But the rate is just very, very slow. And it's really hard on some of these to see that sinus, the P wave from the atrium. But you have your QRS complex, T wave, QRS complex, T wave, QRS complex, T wave. Now, so sinus bradycardia, you will have a P wave, you will see normal electrical activity, and things will go on as normal. Sinus tachycardia, same thing. You see a P wave preceding every T wave, just the rates will go on. So we have disturbances of impulse conduction. And by this, we're mostly talking about the AV node. When we're talking about AV block, we are only talking about AV block. So first degree AV block, as we said before, is just a very long refractory period, dangerously long and slow delay between the P wave and the QRS complex. First degree block. It's not actually causing an arrhythmia or missed beats, but it is putting a big delay in there. That big delay is causing some ill timing between ventricles filling and relaxing versus atrium. So it isn't entirely benign. Second degree AV block, that's what's known as episodic conduction failure. And that comes in a lot of different flavors. So if you have an impulse going from the atrium, comes to the AV node, and that AV node conducts it through the first time just fine. You have another one come through, and it's fairly fast, comes from this sinus node, goes through the atrium, comes up to the AV node, and this time it's refractory. Well, nothing happens. And all of a sudden you have a P wave, and then no following QRS complex or T wave. You'll have another P wave come along. This time the AV node will maybe have recovered, and it'll fire, and you'll see normal. Then then you go on the next one, you're still refractory, it stops. And this is sort of a one-to-one conduction failure. So you can have one-to-one, where one goes through, one doesn't. One goes through, one doesn't. Sort of alternating. Not alternans, but alternating. You can have more complicated behavior where it goes, maybe 3 will go through and then you miss one. 4 will go through and then you miss one. And the study of what causes this type of behavior and in complex responses under various situations and what to do about it in terms of changing that refractory period is a research area. But that's what second degree block is. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And it can be varying degrees of severity. Third degree AV block is pretty bad for you. Complete conduction failure. So what you see is T waves and no ventricular conduction. And unless you implant a pacemaker and directly pace the ventricle, you will be in big trouble very quickly. So third-degree AV block is just complete conduction failure. It just doesn't go through that AV node. The his Purkinje will, under those circumstances, start to fire automatically. But they do so at a rate that is far too low to sustain life for very long. So you have in that system a third backup, as it were, but not a very good one. And then you can have AV block conduction and impairment in the his Purkinje system. And we talked about the his Purkinje system, where we might have right bundle branch block, fragmentation of the QRS complex because the two chambers of the heart are beating asynchronously. So last lecture, we went through, theoretically, what happens in Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome. That is where you have more than one pathway through that fibrous basal disc that separates the atria from the ventricle and causes a reentrant type of block. And this is now looking at it in terms of how would you see this on an EKG before waiting for an arrhythmia or a tachycardia to occur. So you have this impulse propagation. You start out with sinus node, and it's normal. It goes through here, would normally go through the AV node, have some delay, and start exciting through here and go through. So same thing we saw in that block diagram with the triangle. So this is sort of our region of non-conducting block. And then, of course, it would go on to excite the left and right ventricles simultaneously. But if we have this region here of sort of a hole, as it were, where the cardiac muscle actually has broken through that fibrous disc and conducts with each other, it's fine in terms of exciting the entire tissue. It goes through here, perhaps with some delay. It's not a normal path. It doesn't have that his Purkinje system to start spreading it effectively through the ventricle. So it does this retrograde conduction, which is relatively slow. And of course, you have regular conduction through the AV node, which is occurring with a delay, and the two fronts meet here and die out because this is excited and this is excited. There's no more tissue left to excite. But on the EKG, you start to see something because you have gone now from the atrium, you've had your P wave fire here, and then it's sort of seeped through this little anatomical hole that you have between what should be resistive between the two chambers of the heart is actually allowing current to go through. That current goes through here and starts to excite this tissue. Well, that's the ventricle. That's got a lot more tissue to it than the atrium. And so you see this business here of an increase prior to the regular QRS complex, which is due to the his Purkinje system firing the remainder of the heart. This little piece that fires early here in this retrograde and slow fashion will show this rise or this delta wave. And it is occurring during the PR interval. So this delta wave occurs, and you have an indicator in the QRS complex morphology changes that something's wrong, that parts of the ventricle are being excited at the wrong time. Now, just before you trigger a reentrant arrhythmia, you'll see your normal P wave. You may actually miss this delta wave because this small amount of tissue here, for one reason or another, may be refractory. And so you go through, you excite your QRS complex pretty much as normal, except for you get back up here. Now you've re-excited. So you hit your T wave. And then before there's a chance for there to be another P wave, because look at the interval here, you have re-excited the atrium, gone through the SA node, and re-excited another QRS complex. Same thing, two-wave goes through, and you see these P-waveless tachycardia. There's no P wave here. There's a QRS complex, there's a T wave, and it's occurring far too rapidly relative to sinus rhythm. Now, there is a choke on this in that you have the delay here. So you can only go so fast, and part of that is determined by the refractoriness of the AV node. And so this represents an AV nodal delay as you go through this system here. So you have, under normal P wave, under sinus rhythm, this Wolff-Parkinson-White will have this delta wave preceding the QRS complex, and that delta wave reflects premature excitation of a portion of the ventricle that's ill-timed. And then when you have an ill-timed set of events, you get that transient unidirectional block. So it's blocking things going this way, but it's not blocking them coming back the other way because of timing. And you set up this reentrant loop, and it manifests itself very nicely in an EKG. So impulse conduction failure is important in the initiation of arrhythmias because it allows you to have waves that would normally have met and therefore died out to ignite or initiate reentry. And this premature beat is now simply half of what would have been a normal beat. And it allows it to propagate through the same thing. Now, the same type of reentry can occur around an infarction, or it can occur around fibrotic tissue, or it can even occur around hypoxic tissue transiently when you have the same type of behavior and you can form those little swirls that you have in the tissue. So arrhythmias, still very important. We have this integration now from what's occurring at the cellular level, changes in potassium, changes in membrane potential, changes in refractoriness, changes in the ions that mediate that conduction, coming together to give us changes in an EKG at the surface of the body that you can measure very quickly and in an emergency. So arrhythmias have a few things that we want to know about from the EKG. We want to know the site of the origin of it, whether it's coming from, the problem is in the sinus node, the atrium, the AV node, specialized conduction system, or the ventricle. And we want to know how bad it is. Sort of what is the nature of the disturbance? Is it an occasional premature beat, ectopic type of focus? Is it tachycardia, which is distressing, but not nearly as bad as fibrillation, which is a situation in which things are so ill-timed that the heart no longer effectively pumps blood. So we have some examples you can think about. An atrial premature beat, so where we have an ectopic focus in the atrium and what happens there. Atrial tachycardia, that is where you start to beat too quickly in the atrium. Or you can have atrial fibrillation, where it completely and totally has a dysfunction. Same thing goes in the ventricle. You can have this sort of hierarchy. Premature beat, not so bad. Tachycardia, worse. Fibrillation, much, much worse. So tachycardia means rapid heartbeat. And it's particularly dangerous when it's due to a reentrant arrhythmia because those tend to degenerate often into fibrillation. So we can tell some of these things from the electrocardiogram. Atrial fibrillation. What do I mean by fibrillation? I mean completely disorganized activity. Those multiple swirls of electrical activity that seem to be going around randomly or what would be argued to be chaotically around the atrium so that you're not getting organized electrical activity. The heart is still getting excited, but the sinus rhythm is no longer in control. The atrium is simply going along, and you get some noise on your trace from the atrium being continuously excited, but it's not very usual. But those random excitations do impinge on the AV node, and they're doing it quite rapidly. Well, what happens? Well, the AV node is, thank goodness, refractory a lot of the time. So that if you are in atrial fibrillation, what you see is a QRS complex. You should be able to see somewhere in here a T wave, although it can be obscured by the noise from the atrial fibrillation as it is in this particular lead. So you have your QRS complex firing normally. In a sense, it's normal. The ventricle is beating, you're pumping blood, it's going at a particular rate. It's limited by the refractoriness of the AV node. So the AV node is sort of serving as a safeguard, keeping those ill-timed impulses from all reaching the ventricle, so the ventricle isn't trying to go, at 200 beats per second or something like that. The AV node is slowing it down. It's there because it is sort of being hit randomly there at various times. What you see is a very irregular set of QRS complexes. So atrial fib, absence of a P wave, or a substitution of what looks like a noisy trace for P waves, and an irregular heartbeat. And the mechanism for that is sort of the AV node serving as a gatekeeper or a rate sort of limiter, a governor, if you will, of the rate at which the heart can fire. So sort of a irregular heartbeat, but still sort of normal ventricular function, just no P wave, no organized P wave, no sinus rhythm. Ventricular fibrillation, you don't see anything. The heart is firing very rapidly and in those irregular swirls. Large portions of tissue at all times are generating currents going in all different directions. And so what you see looks more or less like a random noise going on at all times. And if you think about that sort of sack of worms analogy, yeah, it's kind of like tracking the average movement of a sack of worms. It's just going to look squiggly. So fibrillation of the ventricle is squiggly. You don't see a P wave on here. It's obscured if there was one. Also, you have the retrograde transmission back through the AV node, though causing excitation of the atrium along with this. So you see nothing but noise. Fairly high amplitude noise, but nothing. Whereas with atrial fibrillation, because of the sequence in which you go through excitation, you see irregular heart rate, but not nearly as dangerous as ventricular fibrillation, which will simply cease to function as a pump. So these disturbances of arrhythmias can come from different types of diseases. You can have these anatomical things like Wells-Parkinson-White that may have occurred from scarring or from other types of things, or simply be congenital. You can have congenital abnormalities that way. You can have acquired problems, myocardial infarctions, transient ischemia, low blood flow, and also chemically acquired ones from various methods. So you have a lot of ways in which you can acquire an arrhythmia. The physical ones would be myocardial infarction and anatomical types of things like Wolff-Parkinson-White. Arrhythmias can result from triggered activity. So, you see, probably there's one somewhere in this building, these portable electronic defibrillators. They give you a shock and they reset your heart. Well, you can also get a shock and deset your heart and trigger an electrical event that will not stop. You can start this type of reactivity by an ill-timed electrical impulse to the heart, and then you can have arrhythmias that are resulting from abnormal electrical activity throughout the heart. Well, that's sort of a vague thing I've written down up there. What do I mean by that? Well, You can have a general change. If you get exposed to certain types of drugs, you will have problems in your heart. Ketamine, which is an animal tranquilizer that causes a profound prolongation of the cardiac action potential, largely through block of potassium channels, it's thought. Which is one of the more dangerous things that people have been using as a party drug. It's an animal tranquilizer. It will give you a heart attack fairly reliably if you misdose yourself in the slightest. We do use it as an animal tranquilizer largely because of ease of use. But even the vivarium tells us we shouldn't be using that for our mice. But we still do, simply because of ease of use and preservative types of behavior. Arrhythmias are associated with long QT interval. That's one of these types of changes that can be global. You get a lot of different types of organic compounds, various types of drugs. There was a very famous one called Hismanol or Seldane, which I guess about 10 years ago was a widely used antihistamine. As it turned out, when larger scale studies were done, it lengthened the QT interval of the heart, so it caused a delay in that repolarization. And it was killing quite a few people every year. This was one example of a drug-induced arrhythmia, and in fact, it has become now a required part of all FDA screening that all new products going online for pharmaceutical use have to go through a QT prolongation and arrhythmia screening before they can be approved for use. And the reason for this is that a lot of these drugs were binding to a particularly peculiar channel that's found in the heart. That IKR, that rapid delayed rectifier, one of the two components of that, has a particularly labile structure, particularly of its intracellular pore mouth, that makes it susceptible to a very, very wide range of organic compounds. So lipophilic organic compounds that cross the cell membranes and get in can oftentimes bind this, and the block of this particular channel results in long QT syndrome and sudden cardiac death. And we actually found this out through a study of Mike Sanguinetti and Mark Keating's, followed up by a lot of other things that they had done, that this was due to this drug through a study of the inherited, very rare forms of long QT syndrome in which you had a defect in some of these channels. So these defects in channels really told us where to look to help make drugs more safe. And a lot of times when people ask, well, what's the good of the basic science research you've done? Have you cured a disease? Well, no. A lot of this, we have not yet cured heart disease. But a lot of what we've done that's good is less obvious. And we point to this particular thing as a real quiet lifesaver. If we found that there was this channel with this particular tendency, literally hundreds of drugs have been pulled off the shelf that treat non-threatening things like antihistamines and other products, completely unrelated, and we never would have thought that they would have had cardiac side effects because their particular targets were elsewhere. They've been pulled off, and so literally thousands of lives every year are saved by heart attacks that just didn't occur. So a little bit of knowledge there derived from the study of a very rare disease, human long QT syndrome, has provided us with a great deal of safety for a lot of people. And these are people, taking antihistamines and stuff would have been dying, not, in advanced elderly stages, but early on in their lives. And in particular, women are susceptible to HERG, to block of this ERG or HERG protein. So we have these currents here that have been implicated in this genetic basis of long QT syndrome. We have the sodium channel, which we talked about, that one that causes that fast upstroke. Now, you find that unusual that that might be related to long QT syndrome and arrhythmias. Well, in this case, it's what's known as a gain-of-function mutation, in that its inactivation is defective. So that activation, inactivation, that chemical process of inactivation is incomplete. It doesn't inactivate as well as it should. And that provides that burst of extra sodium current towards the end of the action potential that can create EADs and that prolongs the action potential. So that's what I mean when I was going through about the sodium current under normal circumstances doesn't do anything during repolarization, or does very little. But under abnormal circumstances, it can be, if it opens, can be extremely lethal and forms a form of long QT syndrome. Losing the sodium channel from half of your tissue forms another type of problem, Brugada syndrome. So loss of function of that is also a form of arrhythmia, but with a different, very different set of treatments and very different set of outcomes. We have these transient outward currents, which have been implicated again largely in Brugada syndrome. And then we have IKR and IKS, those two delayed rectifier proteins, which form the ones that cover the majority of inherited arrhythmias. So these inherited arrhythmias, they come up periodically because you read about them in the paper, like these athletes who are sitting there playing basketball or something, and particularly in late adolescence, die suddenly on the court for no apparent reason. A lot of those have these long QT syndrome or other related arrhythmia-type genetic defects. They're very silent. You have to look for them very carefully. I mean, it's only a 10% or so prolongation of that QT interval is sufficient for you to be diagnosed with long QT syndrome. And so you have to actually be looking for it fairly closely. But the main problem there is with these two K currents is this loss of K current. Loss of K current causes a loss of repolarization ability. This loss of repolarization ability means you have to turn on the action potential longer until more current builds up and you're able to completely repolarize the channel. So you can see from these EKG recordings the sort of thing that goes on with them. And they're varied in what they do to the shape of things. So LQT3 is the sodium one, and it's causing this burst, and you see a long, relatively flat period and a very large, sharp QRS complex fairly late. Again, the main thing here is this delay in the onset of these T waves, and the severity of it and what causes these to be more arrhythmic than some are more pro-arrhythmic than other mutations. And that's still a very active form of research. In fact, one that my lab is engaged in is looking at why different forms of long QT syndrome have different outcomes. But all of them are potentially pro-arrhythmic and but needed to be treated in different ways. The sodium channel defect needs to be treated with use-dependent sodium channel blockers. If you give someone with long QT syndrome 1 or 2, which look very similar on EKG, sodium channel blockers, their prognosis gets decidedly worse. So knowing the genetic basis is a strong and important portion of actually determining how to treat a long QT syndrome patient, whether or not they need a implantable defibrillator or something to help them, because they don't have any real problems with their heart in terms of its physical structure, its ability to pump blood or anything. It's simply a defect of the control system. So that control system has to respond to stimulation, and some of these forms of long QT syndrome are more sensitive to, say, the sympathetic system versus the parasympathetic system. And so a burst of sympathetic activity, if you've got long LQT1, is much more disastrous than it is in LQT3. So we have this control system. So Stepping back now again from the disease, which also interacts with the control system, as well as sort of the basal behavior, we go back to how does the heart get controlled? So the SA node is our pacemaker. That's under parasympathetic and parasympathetic control of how quickly and rapidly you're going to pace. That's a really big determinant of cardiac output. Also then, you have the ability to change contractility, how hard you're going to contract, how quickly you're going to relax. And then these come under two components: intrinsic regulation and chemical regulation, sensing pH and other things. So the regulation of contractility and heart rate is really to regulate cardiac output. Cardiac output is important. That's a measure of how much your heart is doing, Sort of equivalent to the idea of work. Force through a distance, or in this particular case, how much volume of blood has been pumped. So heart rate times stroke volume equals cardiac output. What's heart rate? Heart rate is beats per second. What's stroke volume? Stroke volume is, say, in ml per beat. So the cardiac output is how many mLs of blood you have per minute, for instance. So sympathetic and parasympathetic regulatory mechanisms change your cardiac output by changing your heart rate and by changing your stroke volume. So these inputs affect both of these, although primarily sympathetic will work on stroke volume. Parasympathetic is almost entirely on heart rate. Sympathetic works on heart rate and stroke volume. Why is that? Well, because of the way the heart's innervated. So you have these neural fibers coming down from your central nervous system that bring signals in an integrated fashion. You have the vagus, which would be the primary parasympathetic system. And these preganglionic fibers leave the spinal column, and they go and they synapse with the stellate ganglion, middle cervical ganglion, and innervate the heart through the cardiac plexus here, which also includes innervation from the vagus. And that cardiac plexus then goes to the heart, as well as going to the great vessels, because you want to, because not only in terms of output do you need to regulate things, but as we'll discuss a little later, you also need to regulate where the blood goes, whether it goes to your digestive system after you've eaten a meal, or if it's going to go to your legs while you're trying to hunt a meal, for instance. And so it's under a great deal of regulation both on the input and the output side. Now, the distribution is not even. It's not balanced. The parasympathetic activity is largely in the atrium and in the SA node in particular. Sympathetic is really strong in the ventricle, and the two occur at very different rates. So normally, you predominate with parasympathetic tone at rest, and this parasympathetic tone can be depressed and therefore release, and you start to your heart rate goes faster. And of course, with the sympathetic system, you can really rev things up quite a bit farther. But if you're healthy, you're not going to have a lot of sympathetic tone at rest. And then we have, of course, different types of agonists and antagonists. And we'll start again with this next time. But just to let you know, you've got acetylcholine is, of course, the natural agonist of the parasympathetic system. And it has a muscarinic form and a nicotinic form. Atropine is an agonist of that system. And then we have isoproterenol and propranolol that we use as sympathetic agonists. So we'll call things quits here. We'll start talking about sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation of the heart next time. Yes. Hi.
Is your mic on?
Oh, it is.
I'm just asking because I want it off.
Me too.